Okay.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. So good evening, all of you that are on the webinar, and welcome to the second in a series of webinars brought to you by Lake Superior State University. My name is Angie Irwin, and I'm going to be co-presenting this evening's webinar with my colleague, Maria Dawkins, who I'll allow to introduce herself momentarily. I hope, first of all, you can all hear me, so I'm going to suggest to you that if you can't, feel free to just, if you have access to the screen and can type in under the questions quadrant, feel free to type in and I'll make some adjustments at my end so you can hear me as we move forward. As I mentioned, my name is Angie Irwin, and I have the privilege of bringing to you the webinars that are offered throughout this webinar series, again being brought to you by Lake Superior State University. And I want to thank them too for allowing and affording the opportunity to me and to all of you to participate in these webinars. I'm not sure that representatives from Lake Superior State are going to be on the line this evening, but we'll certainly update them and let them know how this all went as we proceed. So if she's ready, I'm going to allow my colleague, Maria Dawkins, to introduce herself, and then we'll move forward with some housekeeping issues and get moving on the webinar substance. So Maria, do you want to go ahead and say a few words?
Hi, this is Maria Dawkins with CS Partners, and I'm happy to join the call today. I am Angie. If I'm just going to myself for a moment, and I'm going to connect from computer if that's okay, so I get a better connection.
Okay, yep, that sounds great. And while Maria's doing that, gang, let me just share with you, Maria is the president and CFO of CS Partners. CS Partners has been a long time reputable management company in the charter school sector. And certainly has forged effective and productive relationships with their charter school board. So I've invited Maria to co-present on this topic, communicating with your educational service provider, ensuring vision integrity through effective communication, quite frankly, because they've been able to do that as an educational service provider in our state. I want to share with you that is the reason why Maria is participating, and no other reason. I mean, she's here to share those best practices that they've experienced as a quality educational service provider in our state, and certainly one that I respect, and as well as Lake Superior State University. Just a couple of housekeeping issues that I'll share with you. As with past webinars, this one is being recorded and it will be uploaded to Lake Superior State's website within the next couple of weeks for future access. I'll also share with you that, again, as in past webinars, I've muted all of you and would ask that as you have questions, and again, if you have access to the questions pane, feel free to type them in there. Otherwise, I'll look for your hand icon. I would ask you to use that. That on my screen appears next to your name. So I will be monitoring that over the next hour as we proceed with this evening's webinar. And certainly at that time, as you have questions, I will unmute you. And we'll monitor the questions that way for the evening. Maria, I'm not sure if you can hear me. If you have anything to add at this time, feel free to do that. If you want to go ahead, I'll advance the screen to the next slide. So here's an agenda for this evening's webinar. As you can see, it's in the order in which the slides will appear. I want to first spend a little bit of time this evening reintroducing you or introducing some of you, if you haven't seen this, to the legal and regulatory framework under which we're operating as a charter school sector. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to be sure that as we continue with the webinar this evening, we're all operating from the same structural context. So that's the purpose for showing you the graphic that will be coming up in the next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about charter performance contract accountability. I have a table that I'm going to share with you. Again, we're not going to go into in-depth conversation on the table. I just want to point out while it's on the screen some salient pieces to the table that will be helpful in our discussion this evening. And then we're going to get into effective communication. What does it look like? How is it defined? We're going to talk about, as Maria and I have seen it through our collective 30 years of experience plus in the charter school sector, what those best practices for effective communication look like. And I've listed them for you: establishing clear expectations, asking wise questions, and sharing balanced and timely information. We're going to talk a little bit more about those ingredients as we get into the presentation. And then finally, we're going to spend time talking about the communication, defining it, establishing those clear expectations, asking those wise questions, sharing balanced and timely information, and then really end our conversation with how do we still ensure that we're both operating, both being the operator and the board, under a shared vision. What's the formal process for doing that? So we're going to tie those pieces together with some discussion around that. So that's going to be our presentation for this evening. I'm sure that will take us up until 7 o'clock, and I'm sure if we're done a little bit earlier, none of you will be too terribly upset, and hopefully we will be, but again, if not, we promise not to go beyond 7 o'clock. Is there anything you'd like to add before we get started?
Absolutely. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I sure can.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And I just wanted to add a little bit more about CS Partners, just in that we currently work with 19 schools providing full service. We work with an additional schools doing just HR resources. And we started in 2004. I've been working with charter schools since 1996, and as Amy mentioned, primarily in the area of finance and overseeing kind of the business services. Although I'm president of the company, I work with boards in many different capacities. So.
Good. Thank you, Maria. So as you Yeah, exactly. So as you hear from Maria, certainly well qualified to speak to some of the topics that we'll be discussing this evening. I also want to share with you, again, before we get too deeply into the webinar tonight, Maria and I understand that there's a whole lot of information out there about relationships and communication. You can read John Maxwell and Stephen Covey and Jim Collins and understand what relationships and effective communication should look like in everyday personal and or corporate settings. What we're bringing to you this evening are what we've seen over the course of our respective experiences in the charter school sector as best practices, as I mentioned earlier. So this is really about forging that operator board relationship in a highly productive manner and really bring to you those experiences that will help support some of what we're presenting to you this evening. So having said that, there's our agenda. I'll advance to our first slide. some of you might have seen this in the past. I'm bringing this to you, compliments of Central Michigan University, so I'll give them credit where credit is due. They actually created this particular graphic through the Center for Charter Schools at CMU. And really, again, quite simply, what I just want to show here is that we're certainly operating under a legal and regulatory constitutional framework in the charter public school sector. You'll see on the left of this graphic the Michigan legislature, whom, as you know, has legislative authority over K-12 education within our state, and primarily that impacts school districts, K-12 as we know them, and intermediate school districts that support their work. On the opposite side of the graphic, I indicate, show the State Board of Education, and as some of you know, through the Michigan Constitution, the State Board of Education has been granted general supervisory authority over all of public education in our state, including charter public education. And as you also are likely familiar, they've delegated that responsibility to the state superintendent, Mike Flanagan, who relies on the Michigan Department of Education team to really operate and provide those day-to-day ministerial functions to the work of public education in our state. The state public universities, public community colleges, school districts, and intermediate school districts are offset by a blue line on this chart, simply to again remind all of you that those are the authorizing bodies in our state, those that have been empowered to issue charter contracts to charter public schools in the state of Michigan. On the bottom of this graphic, you see two arrows, one coming from the authorizing body side, one coming from the State Board of Education side. What this is demonstrating is that the authorizing body has contract and oversight authority of that contract with and for public school academy boards of directors. On the opposite side, the arrow coming through represents that state and federal accountability responsibility that the State Department of Education has for charter public schools. And a lot of those state and federal accountability pieces, as you've experienced, really are incorporated in your charter contract. So as they come through, as the department, it brings new provisions to public education, those typically get incorporated into your charter contract by the team at Lake Superior State University. Obviously, as you know, you as board members are held accountable to your authorizer for ensuring compliance with that charter contract as they work with you to oversee that charter contract. Many of you, about probably 3/4 of the charter school boards operating in our state today, have contracted out those day-to-day functions of the operations of the school to an educational service provider like CS Partners, like Maria is going to discuss during our presentation this evening. So again, just a graphic to give you a sense of context and operational context as we move the conversation forward. The table in front of you attempts to outline very succinctly the respective roles. So the authorizer role, the board role, and the management or operator role in this charter school's work, which we're all engaging. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what this table outlines. What I want to emphasize, and you'll hear me likely re-emphasizing this this evening throughout the webinar, is that regardless of the role that you play in this charter public school work, the accountability remains the same. So I mentioned in the last graphic that the charter school authorizer, as you know, has oversight authority over the charter contract, and that the board is accountable to that authorizer for ensuring compliance to that contract. But I want you to understand that the accountability is really, in general, not about to whom, but about to what. So regardless of your role, you're always accountable to the performance contract, to the performance charter contract, whether you're operator management, whether you're a board or whether you're an authorizer. So I would challenge you to start thinking about accountability in that fashion. We all know that technically the operator is accountable to the board is accountable to the authorizer, but at the end of the day, you are all accountable to the performance charter contract. So just a reminder, just want to put that out there for you to think about, and certainly as we look at that board operator relationship this evening, keep that in mind because we're going to talk about the charter contract throughout our presentation tonight. Is there anything you'd like to add there?
Nothing at this time.
Okay, great, thank you. So looking at communication, what does this whole notion of effective communication look like? So you see, I've got this cartoon that I pulled that I thought was really quite appropriate for our conversation this evening. We know that if we're not all operating under the same communication definition, that we're going to run into some potential challenges. Now, it might not be as serious as, dropping a patient off a hospital table, but it certainly has caused some challenges over the years in relationships. And again, we've seen those, Maria and I, in our respective roles between the board and the operator. So what I want to talk about on this slide, and Maria too, is really look at your role as a board and look at your relationship with your operator. Have you defined together what it means to communicate effectively? We all have different definitions based on our lens of communication and effective communication of what it looks like. I might think something differently than Maria or someone else. So I encourage you that as we're looking at communication to really develop or establish a mutually acceptable definition of effective communication with your service provider, with your operator. That might sound rather elementary to you, but I think oftentimes that's a piece of this puzzle that gets overlooked and doesn't really work well long term if you don't have a common understanding of that. So in the context of that, think about what does effective communication look like for each or both organizations. Does everyone understand when we lift? So referring back to the cartoon, do we on 3 or do we lift after 3? That's certainly the question there. And understanding what that looks like is certainly important for the relationship. And then does everyone understand and respect the flow of communication within the structure? So as we defined the structure a little bit earlier, looking at that in the context of effective communication and what that might look like. So I would encourage you, again, to establish that common understanding of that communication flow. And I think this is particularly important when you're in a relationship as the board with an operator where the operator employs staff, for example. So, what's the role of the operator in that relationship, and what's the role that the board should play in that relationship? So I'm going to ask Maria to maybe talk a little bit about her experience when there is some confusion about that communication piece, and then maybe talk a little bit about what practices they've employed as an educational service provider to alleviate that confusion, and then maybe talk to a little bit, Maria, about what it looks like when there is common understanding of this relationship.
Thank you. I do think communication is a critical component to a successful relationship between the board and the ESP. And working with different boards, I've noticed each board kind of has their own style of communication and their own set of expectations. So as a provider, I can tell you it's important to have those conversations with boards up front on how you like to get your information, what's too much information, what's too little, Some boards like to dig a little deeper. Some just kind of want an overview and a presentation. So really getting a good feel between the groups and what kind of information do you want, so that we know that we're presenting the information to you in a format that you want, and also timely. So when do you expect it? When is enough time for you to be able to review it and ask good questions? I'm on the financial end, and often I always say to boards, if you really want to have some significant financial questions, I would love to hear them in advance before the meeting, because sometimes it's hard for me to get questions at the board meeting if I'm not prepared. So I know if you're having a concern about a certain area, I can kind of do my homework and come to the board meeting prepared to talk about that issue. So again, it's kind of having those conversations up front, so that I don't want to give you the information, but I might not know offhand. And so I want to be able to provide an educated answer, but sometimes to do that I need to look back and see what actually happened. And then Angie brings up a good point regarding the school leader in particular, however it could be all staff. I do find a lot of boards are very dedicated to their school leader, which they should be. They often have a communication with the school leader, which is fabulous, but also want to make sure that we're clear that the contract is with the ESP. So for instance, I always say to the board, we really are a team with our school leader. So if you have concerns about the way the school is running, or concerns about the school leader or some other staff situation, the conversation cannot be with the school leader alone. We really, as the ESP, need to be made aware of the situation, and also to protect that the relationship that the school leader is our employee. And it's important that the board is not viewed as directing the school leader. And so what I always say is, if you have a concern about the school, or even a concern about school leader behavior, really concern our contract with the board. So bring it up to us, and we will make sure it's addressed, whether it's through there or otherwise. So we work very, very close to the school leadership and the team. We don't. We are the part of the management team. It's not separate. Mm-hmm. And so again, open communication is critical. What there, Angie?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. And I would offer to, hopefully you can, again, all hear me. I think maybe my audio is kind of finicky tonight, but at any rate, I think, certainly another piece that we're trying to emphasize here is that, there are, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, because obviously I'm not an attorney and neither is Maria, but there are some legal ramifications when there's appears to be a dual employment role with the staff member. So just recognizing that. But again, in the spirit of this conversation, you need to understand that as a board. You need to understand that when there are staff issues at the school, that it's the employer, the operator, that needs to be informed. And then it's incumbent upon the operator, if they deem it necessary, appropriate, to communicate with the board on what has, potentially transpired. So just understanding what that flow of communication looks like between the operator, staff, and board, I think is an important component of this particular conversation. So just something we wanted to emphasize. Do any of you, I'm going to ask this question and I'll pause for a minute. Do any of you have anything to share relative to that relationship piece, any of your own experiences, any best practices that you've been able to employ or engage that you want to just articulate this evening? So I'll give a couple minutes to raise your hand and I'll unmute you. Well, if you think any, please don't hesitate to put hand up. I'll certainly take questions throughout the webinar in any subject as questions strike you. The other piece we wanted to emphasize here is defining transparency and committing to it. You know, or you likely know, that when the new legislation was enacted in 2011 for charter schools, there was a lot of emphasis placed on transparency, board transparency, operator transparency, meaning your public institutions and the information that's shared within and around your public institution should be public information. So really, again, getting a common understanding of what that transparency looks like for the board, for the operator, what the operator can expect in terms of this transparency piece, and then ensuring that you all continue to commit to that as you move your relationship forward. And I can't emphasize enough, and this is really for boards to ensure happening with your operator, is communicate through common language. I think as educational service providers, as educators, there's a tendency to speak the education jargon and, you know, to maybe throw out language to boards, whether intentional or non-intentional, that you know, you just might not understand because you're not all educators, and we understand that. So just encouraging your service provider, your operator, to be consistent in using a language that all of you can understand, that all of you speak, I think is an important part of this whole effective communications defined piece. So again, Maria, is there anything you want to add to those last 2 points?
Sure. Just in the common language, what's also helpful is just consistency. I'm not an educator, and so I understand when you're at a board meeting and a lot of student data is being shown, and a lot of times it's for a non-educator to understand what is being presented. And so a lot of times in our organization we try to be consistent. So when we're showing the board, we're using some, you know, it's coming to you in the same format every time, so that you kind of learn it once, and then every time you look at it thereafter, you know what you're looking for. We do the same, obviously, in financials, and our monthly report board package. Everything is consistent, so that it's easier for the board to be able to kind of look through it quickly and be able to interpret the data.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And I'll pause for a minute if any of you have questions or thoughts to share before we advance to the next slide. Feel free to use your hand icon, and I'll certainly give you an opportunity to ask the question or share your thoughts. So we'll give us a couple of minutes to do that. Very good. So as promised, the next slide we're going to be discussing are those key ingredients. So again, as we've seen this work, what are the three, as we believe, three primary key ingredients to help ensure effective communication? And those key ingredients are going to be the basis for the next few minutes of our conversation this evening. So establishing clear expectations, asking wise questions, and sharing information. So again, key ingredients based on best practices that we've seen that we're going to articulate here over the next few minutes. So the first one, establishing clear expectations. Know that there are both very concrete ways you can do that, as well as vocal ways you can do that. So what we want to talk about here is establishing clear expectations through meaningful dialogue. So really discussing with each other, what are those timing expectations? When do you as a board expect to receive information from your service provider, and when does the service provider think that they can provide that information to you? And setting reasonable goals with each other that are attainable. So growth versus performance. What do those goals look like? Establishing timelines for follow-up or review. So again, if there are follow-up needs with respect to information that is shared with you, what does that timeline look like? And again, having good conversation, good communication around that. And establishing a format for measurement of goals, a common format. What does that look like? So, Maria, I'm going to stop there for a minute. Is there anything you'd like to talk about or articulate there with respect to meaningful dialogue?
I do think this is very important, and I think the sooner relationship you kind of define these things, the better. I do, in my experience working with boards, not a lot of time is spent on setting kind of those long and short-term goals and what the expectations are. So we all know what our requirements are, we all know where we want to end up, but again, setting reasonable or realistic goals in the short term is an important thing too, because we want to see progress towards that goal to make sure that we can attain it. So I think that's an important step.
Good. Thanks, Maria. So meaningful dialogue is one way you can establish those clear expectations. Another way is through guiding documents. You've got requirements laid out for you, expectations in your charter performance contract. And I've indicated here specifically where you can find some of those. You've got financial reporting expectations, Article 2, Section 2.2 of your contract. Compliance reporting expectations as outlined through your master calendar of reporting requirements. Educational programs goals are set forth in your charter contract in Schedule 7.1. Staff expectations, so as you look at your job descriptions that have been incorporated into the charter contract, Schedule 7.3, what can we expect based upon these responsibilities as we've established them from staff, again, as we move the operations forward at our school. And then assessment expectations. So what are those looking like relative to the charter performance contract? So again, just trying to emphasize the charter performance contract is your final accountability tool. So use it as you think about this relationship, as you establish those clear expectations. You don't necessarily have to start from scratch because you've got these pieces already in some form or fashion articulated to you or for you. So how are you going to use those pieces to establish those clear expectations? You've got a management agreement. Have an educational service provider if you engage them. In the management agreement, there are certain provisions that speak to what the service provider is going to do for you as a charter school board. So use that management agreement to have that conversation about clear expectations. Some of you have adopted board policies. What do your board policies say about clear expectations? And then in conjunction with those board policies, how about those administrative procedures? What is expected through administrative procedures of the operator to carry out these functions operationally that the board has established by policy? So just some examples of how, again, as we continue to think about establishing those clear expectations, how you can do that in a way through meaningful dialogue and through the guiding documents that will get you that, again, that common understanding of what those clear expectations should look like. As we talked about, ingredient 2 is asking wise questions. So some of you that maybe have heard me present before know that this comes up a lot in my presentations, because I think this whole notion of asking wise questions of a board is a pretty important notion. And when I articulate this evening, I'm coming from it in the context of asking wise questions relative to your role of ensuring how well things are happening at the school. So being certain that you're not blindsiding your service provider by asking questions that really have nothing or little to do with how well outcomes or performance outcomes or the charter performance contract. So we've seen these conversations. We've seen these conversations about, you know, the color of the paint on the walls and what that should look like. We've seen the conversations about, you know, operational input issues that really you've delegated the responsibility to your operator to execute. So again, this is being presented, this slide, in the spirit of that conversation. So questions, again, as I've said many times, are focused on the outcomes, the how well of the operations of the management company. Just as I was instructing a few minutes ago, be sure that your how well questions align with the how inputs. So you're not asking questions that have absolutely no relevance or impact on those outcomes relative to student performance, fiscal performance, compliance performance, those three key areas that as a board you're responsible for ensuring. And operator on executing the how, that's where the operator's focus is going to be, on those inputs. So how are they going to you know, ensure through day-to-day activities that the students are learning? How are they going to help you ensure that the money's being cared for? How are they going to render their compliance responsibility? So really focus on the actions, the execution. And, you know, from an operator's perspective, they want to start with the end in mind, right? They want to be able to anticipate those how well outcome-based questions that the board is going to ask of them to ensure that effective input or how execution. So that is what they're thinking relative to that relationship. And I also have a note here that as you're thinking about those wise questions, again, in the spirit of effective communication, be sure that your board meeting agenda provides for this kind of discussion. So those of you that have participated in National Charter Schools Institute presentations in the past, which, as you know, is my former employer, some time talking about what we call the 30-30-30 agenda, which assumes a 90-minute meeting where 30 minutes of the meeting are dedicated to student performance, to education, 30 minutes of the meeting to the business operations, and then 30 minutes of the meeting dedicated to whatever might be relevant to the board, whether it's your own professional development or any other pressing issues that the board might need to discuss in a board meeting. But all that to say, again, as we're looking at being effective communicators and structuring our communication in intentional ways, using your agenda to support the effective communication relative to these wise questions. Again, both from a board perspective and an operator perspective. And Maria, is there anything you'd like to add here?
Just to kind of link this to the previous page also, you know, I think what's important is if you have those clear expectations and you've already defined how you're going to measure or how you're going to look at those outcomes to see if you're meeting those expectations, defining that again up front, and then your management team, so your school leadership included, is responsible to report to you on a regular basis how you're doing on those outcomes. And in the middle of that, so in between setting the goal or the expectation and the communicating how we're doing, in the middle is where we, as the management of the school, the how, do the work. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of a little bit of a different way to look at it, and then, you know, to communicate to how doing it with you and another thing I think is important is we can touch on every, maybe every aspect or every goal or every expectation at every meeting. So kind of defining what is timing. At what point during the year do we look at student data? While the school is working every month, we may not report to you every month. We're of course going to report it to you after we do our WEA or our Global Dollars performance rate. We're of course after the MEP, after the top to bottom, after other state reports. Every time we do an assessment from the school. But we define that for you up front so that you know this is the this can be provided to me and this is when I can expect it. We're going to be looking at the audits in the fall. We're going to be setting our budget in the spring. Those kind of discussions. So again, you have really clear expectations on when this information is going to be provided to you.
Mm-hmm. Good, thanks, Maria. So we wanted to take an opportunity too, as we're talking and thinking about WISE questions. What do WISE questions from the board's perspective look like? So we've listed a few for you on your screen. Remember, these are how well questions, right? So how well are our students performing on the MEP? How well are our students performing on nationally normed tests? How well are our students achieving compared to schools in our district, state, nationally? How well are we doing preparing our students for college? And I provided there what possible measurements you can use for that, and how well are we doing fiscally. So we're going to talk a little bit about, as we get into sharing information, some of the ways that the operator can present this information to you that is appropriate, some of the ways that aren't appropriate. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. So again, in the spirit of WISE questions, just sharing for you some sample WISE questions that you as the board might want to consider and certainly add to as you look at your respective schools. But remember, fair questions that any operator should be able to answer at the appropriate time. So not questions about paint, about furniture, about things that might not have, they're relevant, don't mistake that, they're relevant, I understand that, but are they relevant for the conversation with the board or with the operator as you're looking at those how well outcomes? And WISE questions from the operator to the board. So Maria, if you want to tackle these, you feel free to do that.
And I just want to also mention some of, and what I had on a board-wise question is, even, looking at the culture of the school is very important, and so, asking questions about how satisfied our parents, how satisfied are the students and the staff, are those how questions as well. From an operator, some questions that we need to ask you as the board. What are short and long-term goals of the academy? You may have a facility project. You may want to move things that aren't in current year, but things that we need to know about and work on. How can we best uphold the mission, vision, and values of the school? One of the things I know that I value about the charter school movement is that we are independent schools, all with our own uniqueness and our unique goals and culture and community. And so how can we uphold your mission as a school in honoring that mission? And what, to piggyback that, what unique qualities does your community have that we need to understand? What experience has the school and board had in the past that we should be aware of? Many of the schools I work with currently were with the previous provider, and often that comes with, things that have happened in the past, and if you know what those are, it just helps the relationship moving forward. And then we constantly need to ask, how are we doing, to get that feedback from you as our customer on how are we doing to meet your goals. And then what other information do you need from us to demonstrate our performance, not only academically, fiscally, like I said, parent satisfaction, staff satisfaction, staff turnover rate, enrollment retention, things along those lines.
Good. Thanks, Maria. So again, I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to ask you, how are you doing in this area as board members? Do you feel you're asking the wise questions, and do you feel that your operator is asking wise questions of you to get you to those how well questions that you need to ask or that you do ask as a board? So again, if anyone would like to just share some comments with respect to this, free to raise your hand, and I'd love to hear from you. Again, as you have those thoughts, don't hesitate to share them as we advance the slides. And then, finally, ingredient number 3, sharing balanced and time-appropriate information. So what should and does that look like? And again, those of you that participated in the last webinar in November that I co-presented with my colleague Mark Weinberg, or that, right, he was the key presenter I co-presented, some of these visuals might look familiar to you. So we first want to touch on this sharing balance and time-appropriate information idea with academic reports, because obviously those are critical. You receive those. So just give you some examples of what might not be appropriate. So we've seen these kinds of reports that I'm showing on your screen. You see there's a lot of information there, probably a little too much, a little too complicated for me, I'm sure too complicated for board members to understand. We did great on the MEP. That is not a report. That's a statement that you should not accept, because that's far too little information that in some ways is just meaningless. So as you're having conversations with your operator, communication about results, make sure that anytime there's verbal statements like this, that it can be supported with information, with good, helpful information. So then what's appropriate? Here are a couple of just quick visuals that at least show you how well you're doing academically in a snapshot. Again, just a quick visual to show you what, for example, on the left, student performance with the check marks. You're on track in English, math, reading. You're meeting achievement targets. Maybe not so much on growth targets in English and math. You're meeting growth targets in reading and science, and you're not meeting achievement targets in science on the opposite side. So again, just those quick visuals. And same with the other graphic to the right. You see just a quick, quick piece of, how well are we doing, based on outcome from a percentage perspective. So we deem that kind of information to be very appropriate, frankly. And then certainly as the board wants more detail, and again, you're going to have conversation, right? So tying it back to defining effective communication, defining clear expectations, you're going to have conversation around what is appropriate for you, what is too much, too complicated, what is too little, too meaningless. So if you want more detail, certainly you can ask for more detail as the board. That is your prerogative to ask for additional detail if maybe this isn't quite enough. But again, the purpose of this slide is to show you that you don't need to be bombarded with numbers, with results, with a whole lot of paper that frankly doesn't tell you as much as a single visual that just gives you a sense of where we're at on this, as these charts indicate, on achievement and growth. Sharing information through simple graphs and visuals that still address the how well outcomes questions is very important. And then, as Maria alluded to a couple of minutes ago, we're demonstrating here what academic reports look like appropriately and inappropriately, but we also recognize that academic reports, academic information is not going to be available at every board meeting, at least in the context of what you see here. So this is just, again, an example of the kinds of information that can be shared with you. What's time for that? But we would also say establish those reporting timelines. When can the board expect academic information, financial information reports, compliance information reports, etc.? And Maria, anything you'd like to add there?
For me, just the only thing to think about too when you are asking those how questions or working on what kind of information you do want to look at, to especially when it comes to academic data, to make sure it is tying into your contractual requirements. I have seen, I've come into working with boards when they've looked at data regularly from an educational service provider, and so they were really surprised when their authorizer notified them they weren't meeting their contractual goals because the information that was shared with them looked positive. So again, you want to make sure the information is relevant and you know what you're looking at, and that you are keeping those guiding documents or those barter contracts with those requirements are when you're looking at this data.
Good. Thanks, Maria. So we want to give you a sense of that same balance and time appropriate information with financial reports. So again, as you're looking at as the board at these financial reports, you see something like this is not going to make any sense to you. And I have to tell you, I think this actually is a financial report. I pulled it. So not appropriate. That is too much, too complicated, as we shared in the prior slide with respect to the academic report. We are on budget. Again, too little, meaningless, not good information. Here are a couple of ways that frankly, CS Partners and Maria presents financial information to their managed board. So I'll let her speak a little bit to what kind of feedback she's gotten with these and just kind of share, again, some thoughts with respect to them.
Well, I'll just talk a little bit about these two graphs that are here in particular and then elaborate a little bit. The first one I thought was useful because, as we all know, it's tough times in Michigan budget-wise. And this picture really clearly represents most districts in Michigan. Most charters used to operate with, $300 to $400 more per student. And while we are getting some best practice and money, we're not back to the level that we used to. And so when my boards are really struggling to balance their budget and they don't know why it's so difficult, I always like to remind them how we're dealing with less money here. So we're not able to give the kind of raises we want or to add the programs we want. We are trying to do more for less these days. So that helps represent that change. The other graph shows a percentage of fund balance. As I mentioned, a lot of times when I give a financial report at a board meeting, they ask me questions like, what was this check for? And again, I may know or I may not know. The bigger questions to me are, what is our fund balance percentage and where do we want it? Are we comfortable with the level our fund balance is at? The other thing I think is really important for boards to keep their eye on is what percentage of our total expenditures are spent on instruction. So you want to give your management, your principal, and your management some flexibility on where to buy their pencils from. But you do want to set some expectations for, we expect 50% or higher, a certain percentage of our expenditures to be in the classroom versus other areas of the budget. So looking more at those bigger global issues that will drive the performance versus focusing on some of the smaller details, like where do you buy things, and what color are we painting the halls, and things like that.
Yep, good. Thank you, Maria. So as I mentioned, we covered what we thought were the three key ingredients to effective communication. We talked about defining effective communication, but we still need to track formally, as I say here, that mutual commitment to the shared vision. So how do we do that? One way we can do that is through an effective assessment tool. So we're going to talk a little bit about developing that assessment tool. So I've got some points here that I want to share with you. So when you're looking at formally assessing your operator as a board, I would ask you to be sure that both parties understand the evaluation criteria and how it's going to be used. So identify and discuss that evaluation criteria together. Assess against expectations as articulated through meaningful dialogue in those guiding documents. So we talked about those clear expectations a little bit earlier. We talked about tools you can use to help get you to those clear expectations. But again, be sure that as you're looking at those, as you establish those expectations, that you're assessing against those. And then mutually develop the instrument. Some of you know that Lake Superior State University has provided you with a sample of an evaluation tool, or as I like to say, an assessment template. So that's a framework. And I think if Nick were on the line, he would share with you that it's to encourage you to develop a tool and to administer a tool with your boards and or with your operator, I'm sorry, and to mutually develop that together. So there's, again, common understanding about what the expectations are relative to the evaluation criteria. And then always understanding that evaluation is an ongoing two-way process, not a one-way single event. So we tend to think about evaluation as a point in time. I would say that even though your authorizer has provided you with this framework to administer at least annually, with your charter school operator, evaluation should be ongoing. So you should be having conversations, just as Maria articulated one of those WAS operator questions. How are we doing? So the informal conversation around how are we doing is important to engage in as well. And I would also share with you that a good evaluation tool incorporates intentional follow-up. So those follow through in action steps. So again, all in the spirit of that effective communication and ensuring through a tool like a formal evaluation tool that you're all on the same track and that mutual commitment to the shared vision. In the spirit of that. I think that Larry Lindquist is on the call, and he's a field rep for Lake Superior State University. So Larry, if you can hear me and want to maybe speak to this assessment piece on behalf of Lake Superior State University, I would certainly welcome you to do that. Gary, if you can hear me, you can go right ahead and talk. Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we sure can.
Okay. I would agree with what's on the screen here. It's a very important part of the overall relationship between any ESP and any board. Like an ESP is an employee of the board. They should expect to be evaluated, and you should expect to evaluate them. Ongoing process. Don't wait until things are going poorly to be conversation. And if things are going well, know about that as well. Mm-hmm. Everybody likes a little compliment now and then.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Larry. Those are good points as well. And we tend not to compliment or comment when things are going well, but I think an important point is all, again, in the spirit of communication, ensure that that providing that feedback to your operator on how well they're doing. Maria, is there anything that you'd like? Oh, sorry, did you want to say something else?
And one more thing, if I
Sure.
can. Angie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please. Critical here to establish that criteria. And just recently I've been saying, be sure to establish mutually agreeable goals between you and the board. Some of us have been evaluated on at our jobs on criteria that we weren't even aware of at the time,
Right.
or at least didn't have adequate notice about. Establish those goals up front so that at the end of a contract period or whatever evaluation period might be, you can have some concrete data to back up for the result of that goal evaluation might be.
Mm-hmm.
And, 2 or 3 goals is good. You can expect any ESP to 25 goals at one time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Larry. Maria, is there anything that you would like to add, again, with respect to your experience being evaluated?
Sure. I appreciate everything both of you said, and I like the comparison to an employee evaluation. It is very much similar. We do need to know how we're doing, and we do need to set goals for ourselves with the board. And I think I've worked with a few boards that have done assessment of the ESP. There's another authorizer in the state that requires it, and they actually define the format. I can tell you those circumstances, I find that the board is more of a compliance issue for the board, and it's not used in a useful way for the board or for the ESP. We have a great relationship with both of those boards, so it's not a big issue. Other boards that have kind of customized and created their own, and often they included strategic planning goals as part of I guess our assessment was linked to their goals, and they've used, one of them uses like the SMART goal format. And so as a board, they have strategic planning where they set these goals, and we're included in those meetings. And then part of their assessment of us includes how are we doing as a group on hitting those SMART goals that the board has set. So to be useful, I like to incorporate as much as we can really specific goals to that academy. If you look at some of the designed assessment tools out there, it's pretty general language. How are we getting information to you? Is it timely? Is it in the format you like? Those kind of things, and it's not specific to what we're trying to accomplish at this academy. So again, the more specific, the more useful it is to make sure we're all on point.
Thanks, Maria. That's a good point, and she and I actually spent a little bit of time talking about this. The fact that you don't use the evaluation tool as a compliance checkpoint, because it can be such an effective way to ensure this vision integrity, to ensure effective communication. So that's essentially what Maria was suggesting is it as it should be treated, and that is, again, that two-way conversation about how we're doing, how the operator is doing, and again, assessing those expectations and those goals accordingly. So that is essentially it, and I promised you I'd have you done in an hour, and we got a little bit of a late start, so I think we hit that hour mark. But just to summarize what we talked about this evening, again, establish those clear expectations, be communicative and transparent in your relationships, speak the same common language, understand roles and responsibilities, and be knowledgeable of inputs, but focus on outcomes by asking wise questions, and develop modify assessment evaluation tool together. So, and one other piece that it's being communicative and transparent falls under that category, but really establish what effective communication looks like, and ensuring that you have a common definition around that piece. Larry, before we close out, is there anything you'd like to add on behalf of Lake Superior State University?
Participants for joining us tonight, and we look forward to providing more webinars for more administrators in the future. Thank you all for time and effort on behalf of your academies.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Larry. And I will also say to you, I'll give you a minute to share any of your final thoughts as a group, but I'll offer that the next webinar that will be brought to you by Lake Superior State University will be likely at the end of February. So you'll be seeing some invitations with respect to that. And that is going to elaborate a little bit more on relationship. So understanding this whole notion of a three-legged stool, the board, the ESP, and the authorizer. So we'll be developing that and bringing it to you, as I mentioned, at the end of February. So again, I'll give you just a minute to share any final thoughts with us, and then I will let you go back to what hopefully is a nice cup of hot chocolate as you try to stay warm in this very cold weather. James, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Great, thank you.
It's the wrong button, but I'm sorry. I was trying to cut this thing off since you were through. But I thank you so much for the information that you have given, and I hope that we be better board this year than we were last year.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye. And Eileen Maria, is there anything you'd like to add as final thoughts? Minutes, Maria, to share any final thoughts. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Anyways, no, I just want to thank you for letting me participate. This was my first time co-hosting a webinar, so it's always fun and exciting to try something new, and I appreciate you trusting me enough to participate on the webinar. And that's about it. So have a great evening, everybody.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Maria. And thank you all. Again, this will be uploaded to Lake Superior State University's website within the next couple of weeks, so you can certainly access it for future reference. So I hope you all enjoyed the presentation and gleaned one or two nuggets from it, and we'll move forward in using those. And as always, if you have any feedback, do not hesitate to email me or Nick or the Lake Superior State University team. So thank you all again for participating, and we will talk to you again at the end of February. Have a wonderful evening.